China's bold 84% tariff, a retaliatory power play in a global economic showdown. In a dramatic escalation of tensions with the United States, China has unleashed an 84% tariff on American goods, a move that reverberates far beyond a typical trade dispute and signals a seismic shift in Beijing's approach to Washington's aggressive economic policies. Unlike previous responses, which leaned toward measured adjustments or diplomatic backchannels, this tariff represents a deliberate and forceful counterstrike, one that experts interpret as China drawing a line in the sand. Announced not through quiet negotiations, but splashed across state-run media outlets, the decision underscores Beijing's intent to make this confrontation both public and unmissable, a calculated message aimed at rallying its domestic audience while projecting strength to the world. The tariff scope is staggering. Rather than zeroing in on specific industries or product categories, it blankets the entirety of U.S. exports to China, tightening the flow of goods into a market that ranks as America's third-largest export destination. This broad application amplifies its impact, threatening to disrupt supply chains, inflate costs, and send shockwaves through industries reliant on access to Chinese consumers. Historically, China has preferred a tit-for-tat strategy in trade disputes, responding to U.S. tariffs with proportional measures designed to maintain a delicate balance. However, the 84% tariff marks a departure from this playbook, reflecting a strategic pivot toward direct economic confrontation. Analysts suggest this shift may have been brewing for months, fueled by mounting frustration with U.S. policies that have incrementally squeezed Chinese exports through escalating duties. Beijing's leadership appears to have concluded that a soft-handed approach no longer suffices in the face of Washington's unrelenting pressure. By opting for such a steep and sweeping tariff, China is not merely reacting, it's asserting its willingness to endure a prolonged standoff, betting that its economic resilience and global trade networks can weather the storm better than its American counterpart. The public nature of the announcement adds another layer of significance. By bypassing traditional diplomatic channels and leveraging state media, China ensures that its citizens see this as a stand against foreign aggression, bolstering national unity at a time when economic challenges like slowing growth and geopolitical tensions loom large. Globally, the move serves as a warning. Beijing is prepared to push the boundaries of economic warfare, even at the risk of destabilizing international markets. For the U.S., where exports to China include everything from agricultural products to high-tech goods, the tariff threatens to hit hard, particularly in sectors already grappling with post-pandemic recovery. As the world watches this superpower clash unfold, China's 84% tariff stands as a bold opening salvo, one that redefines the stakes and sets the stage for a battle that could reshape the global economic order. U.S. strikes back with a historic 125% tariff, Trump's high-stakes gamble to reshape America's economy. In a swift and audacious counterpunch to China's 84% tariff, the 47th President of the United States, widely understood to be Donald Trump, signed an executive order slapping an unprecedented 125% tariff on Chinese goods, a figure that shatters all prior benchmarks in the fraught history of U.S. China trade relations. This wasn't a subtle nudge or a negotiating tactic. It was a thunderous declaration of economic war, amplifying an already tense standoff between the world's two largest economies. But the tariff itself is only part of the story. Accompanying the order was a rallying cry from the White House: "Bring the supply chain back to America." This bold directive reveals a deeper ambition beyond mere retaliation, a vision to rewire the U.S. economy by pulling industries home, reducing reliance on foreign manufacturing, and reigniting domestic production. Yet, as analysts dissect this move, it's clear the strategy is a double-edged sword, brimming with both promise and peril. The 125% tariff later threatened to climb even higher to a staggering 50% additional hike, pushes the cumulative burden on Chinese imports toward an unthinkable 104% in some scenarios. For American consumers, this could mean everyday items. Think a $20 toy ballooning to $40 or a $400 iPhone soaring to $800, becoming luxury goods overnight. Trump frames this as a necessary punishment for Beijing's aggression, a way to level the playing field after years of what he calls unfair trade practices. Yet, beneath the rhetoric lies a grander plan: reindustrialization. By making Chinese goods prohibitively expensive, the administration hopes to force companies to relocate factories to U.S. soil, creating jobs and bolstering national self-sufficiency. It's a throwback to Trump, America First ethos, a promise to revive the Rust Belt and restore manufacturing might, echoes of campaign pledges that once electrified his base. But the road to this vision is treacherous. Shifting global supply chains isn't a flick of a switch. It's a costly, complex overhaul. Industries tethered to Asia's low-cost labor and raw materials, like electronics, textiles, and automotive parts, face a stark choice: absorb higher production costs in the U.S., pass them on to consumers, or lose competitiveness altogether. Post-pandemic realities only sharpen the dilemma, with businesses already stretched thin by inflation and logistical snarls. Some experts warn that smaller firms might not survive the transition, while larger corporations could resist, opting to source from other nations rather than return home. Trump's gamble hinges on American resilience, but the immediate fallout, skyrocketing prices, disrupted imports, and market panic, suggests the cure might wound as deeply as the ailment. As the tariff war intensifies, the U.S. stands at a crossroads: a triumphant return to industrial glory or a self-inflicted economic quagmire. Global markets reel. A trade war shockwave sends stocks plunging and oil prices crashing. As the U.S. and China traded titanic tariff blows, the global economy staggered under the fallout, with financial markets worldwide buckling in a matter of hours. The announcement of China's 84% tariff, followed by the U.S. retaliatory 125% levy, ignited a cascade of panic that spared no corner of the globe. In Asia, the reaction was swift and brutal. Japan's Nikkei index plummeted 2.3%, a sharp drop reflecting fears of disrupted trade flows, while the Shanghai Composite shed 1.8% in its morning session before clawing back some losses later in the day. Europe fared no better. France's CAC 40 and Germany's DAX each tumbled over 2%, as investors grappled with the specter of a full-blown trade war choking supply chains and sapping consumer demand. But the most jarring signal came from the energy markets. Brent crude oil nosedived to a mere $47 per barrel, its lowest since 2021, a stark indicator that global growth expectations were evaporating fast. This wasn't just a ripple, it was a tsunami. The synchronized market declines underscored a grim reality. No economy, no matter how distant from the U.S. China fray, could escape the collateral damage. Asia's losses tied directly to its role as a manufacturing hub, heavily reliant on smooth trade with both superpowers. Europe's downturn reflected its vulnerability to supply chain snarls and shrinking export markets, as American and Chinese goods became pawns in the tariff chess game. The oil price collapse told an even bleaker story. Energy demand, a barometer of industrial activity, was cratering as businesses braced for leaner times. For context, $47 per barrel harks back to an era of economic stagnation, a far cry from the robust post-pandemic recovery many had hoped for. Analysts pointed to a domino effect: tariffs jacking up costs, companies slashing production, and consumers tightening belts, all conspiring to drag the world toward recession. In the U.S., the carnage was even more pronounced. Wall Street hemorrhaged between 10% and 15% in days, with some estimates pegging total losses at $6.4 trillion, others as high as $10 trillion, erasing wealth at a pace unseen in modern history. Hedge funds fled to safe havens like gold and treasuries, while Asian markets like Hong Kong's Hang Seng saw their worst single-day drop in decades, plunging 13%. The numbers painted a picture of chaos, but the human cost loomed larger. Investors watched portfolios vanish, businesses faced slashed revenues, and workers eyed layoffs as corporate giants reeled. This global market meltdown wasn't just a reaction to tariffs. It was a referendum on a world order fraying at the edges, with two superpowers gambling recklessly at everyone else's expense. As the dust settled, one truth emerged. This trade war's fallout was a universal burden, a stark warning that economic brinkmanship could unravel decades of interconnected prosperity. China's arsenal unleashed. From tariffs to rare earths, Beijing's multi-pronged retaliation looms. With the U.S. escalating tariffs to a staggering 125% and threatening a further 50% hike, China isn't backing down. It's gearing up for a counteroffensive that could redefine this trade war's trajectory. Beijing's initial 84% tariff was just the opening salvo. Now, it's poised to deploy a multifaceted arsenal that could squeeze the U.S. economy in ways tariffs alone never could. One option is ratcheting up duties even higher, potentially by 10% to 20%, on high-value U.S. exports like smartphones, laptops, and cutting-edge electronic components. In past skirmishes, China has slapped tariffs worth up to $60 billion on American goods, targeting soybeans, cars, and tech parts. If tensions boil over, that figure could balloon past $100 billion, hammering U.S. tech giants who rely on Chinese markets and materials, turning consumer gadgets into collateral damage in this escalating feud. But tariffs are just the tip of the iceberg. China holds a trump card: rare earth elements, the obscure yet indispensable minerals powering everything from iPhone screens to electric car batteries and military hardware. Controlling 60% to 70% of the global supply, once peaking at 90%, Beijing could throttle exports, a move it's flirted with before. In 2019, rare earths made up 16% of China's export value, and restricting them now could cripple U.S. manufacturers overnight. Imagine Tesla or Apple scrambling for alternatives as production costs soar. Substitutes exist, but they're scarce, expensive, and years away from scaling. Analysts call it a disguised export ban, a silent weapon that could leave American innovation gasping for air while China flexes its resource dominance. Beyond brute force, China's got subtler tricks up its sleeve. Non-tariff barriers, like slowing customs clearance with rigorous safety checks on U.S. imports, especially food and pharmaceuticals, could grind American supply chains to a halt. Past delays have stalled 10% to 20% of goods, piling costs onto businesses already reeling from tariffs. Then there's the yuan. Devaluing it by 5% to 10% could make Chinese exports cheaper globally, blunting U.S. tariff pain while luring buyers elsewhere. Historically, Beijing let the yuan hit a decade low in 2018, and it could do so again, turning currency into a strategic lifeline. Meanwhile, China's pivoting to new markets, boosting trade with ASEAN and Belt and Road nations, where exports have surged 15% to 20%, aims to wean itself off U.S. dependence, building a trade fortress that could outlast this storm. These moves paint a picture of a China ready to fight on multiple fronts: economic, technological, and diplomatic. Each step amplifies pressure on the U.S., threatening not just profits but the very foundations of its industrial and consumer lifeblood. Beijing's message is clear. It's not just reacting, it's rewriting the rules of engagement, daring Washington to match its resolve in a showdown with no easy victors. The world pushes back. EU and Canada join the fray as tariffs spark global resistance. As the US and China hurl tariffs at each other like economic missiles, America's 125% levy clashing with China's 84% counterstrike. The battlefield is expanding beyond these two titans. The European Union, unwilling to sit idly by as trade chaos engulfs the globe, fired its own shot just hours after Washington's latest move, imposing a 25% tariff on a swath of U.S. goods. This wasn't a direct jab at the U.S. China spat, but Brussels made its stance crystal clear. It won't be a passive punching bag in this escalating war. The EU's targets, automobiles, industrial machinery, and packaged foods, strike at American exports already scrambling for new markets to offset losses in China. For Europe, it's a defensive play. Without action, its internal market risks becoming a dumping ground for surplus goods displaced by the superpower showdown, destabilizing its own industries and consumers. Across the Atlantic, Canada isn't mincing words either. Prime Minister Mark Carney, with a steely resolve, has vowed retaliation, branding Trump's tariffs unjustified, unwarranted, and misguided. His threat isn't hollow. Canada, a key U.S. trading partner, could hit back with duties that make America feel the sting, leveraging its proximity and economic ties. This isn't just about protecting Canadian interests. It's a signal that the ripple effects of Trump's policies are fraying alliances and pushing neighbors to draw their own lines. Carney's defiance echoes a broader sentiment. The U.S. can't dictate global trade terms without consequences, and partners won't hesitate to bite back if pushed too far. This widening resistance marks a pivotal shift. What began as a bilateral slugfest between Washington and Beijing is morphing into a global fracture, a phenomenon some are calling reverse globalization. The EU's 25% tariff isn't just about self-preservation. It's a strategic move to assert autonomy, ensuring European manufacturers don't drown under a flood of redirected American exports. Meanwhile, Canada's stance amplifies the chorus of dissent, hinting at a coalition of nations unwilling to let the U.S.-China feud dictate their fates. Other players, from ASEAN to Russia, are watching closely, potentially eyeing their own countermeasures as trade routes buckle and markets tremble. The Brent crude plunged to $47 per barrel and stock drops, like Hong Kong's 13% nosedive, only fuel the urgency as global economies brace for a prolonged storm. For Trump, this is a rude awakening. His America First gambit, meant to strong-arm China and reindustrialize the U.S., is instead isolating it on the world stage. Allies and rivals alike are recalibrating, forging new trade pacts and raising walls where bridges once stood. The EU and Canada's defiance isn't just a footnote. It's a harbinger of a world realigning against unilateral overreach, turning a two-way trade war into a global standoff with stakes no one can fully predict. America's heartland hurts. Trump's tariff war crushes families and sparks a wave of fury. As the U.S.-China tariff showdown spirals, China's 84% levy met with America's 125% counterpunch. The fallout isn't confined to boardrooms or stock tickers. It's slamming into the lives of everyday Americans with brutal force. Prices are soaring. A $20 toy now costs $40, a $400 iPhone jumps to $800, and a new car could tack on $6,000 to $12,000 to the sticker price. This isn't just inflation. It's a gut punch to the middle and working classes, already stretched thin after years of economic upheaval. Services aren't spared either. Nursing care, public transit, even banking fees are climbing as businesses pass on tariff-driven costs. Meanwhile, the U.S. stock market has shed a staggering $6.4 trillion in days, with some estimates ballooning to $10 trillion, vaporizing retirement savings and leaving families staring at a future where decades of hard work vanish in a flash. The human toll is stark. Big companies, squeezed by shrinking profits and disrupted supply chains, are slashing jobs in droves. Manufacturing and service sectors, lifelines for millions, are buckling as firms scale back or shutter entirely. Unemployment is ticking up, and consumer debt is ballooning, trapping low- and middle-income households in a financial vice. Gas prices climb, credit card bills swell, and the cost of living, housing, groceries, healthcare, skyrockets beyond reach. For retirees, The market crash is a personal disaster, eroding nest eggs they counted on for security. Trump's promise of making America great again rings hollow as families watch their dreams dissolve, replaced by a daily grind of rising bills and shrinking options. The administration's vision of reindustrialization, meant to bring jobs home, feels like a distant mirage when the immediate reality is layoffs and empty wallets. This economic carnage has ignited a firestorm of discontent. Across the U.S., from bustling cities to quiet rural towns, protests are erupting, hundreds of thousands strong, chanting not just against tariffs but a government they feel has abandoned them. "I voted for Trump, and this isn't what I voted for." One demonstrator's cry captures a growing betrayal among his base. The anger isn't abstract. It's visceral, rooted in lost livelihoods and a sense that Washington's tariff obsession prioritizes geopolitical flexing over people's survival. These aren't just rallies. They're a roar of frustration from the unemployed, the debt-ridden, and the disillusioned, groups hit hardest by policies that promised prosperity but delivered pain. As grocery lines lengthen and savings dwindle, the protests signal more than unrest. They hint at a political reckoning, a nation questioning whether Trump's economic gamble has broken its backbone instead of building it stronger. For millions, this isn't a trade war. It's a personal war for survival, fought on the streets and in the wreckage of their finances. Allies turn foes. Trump's tariff fallout fractures his inner circle and shatters MAGA faith. Donald Trump's tariff crusade, unleashing a 125% levy on China and sparking a global trade war, hasn't just tanked markets or enraged foreign leaders. It's cracked open a rift within his own camp, turning loyalists into skeptics and threatening the very coalition that propelled him to power. The numbers are brutal. A $6.4 trillion stock market wipeout, with some pegging losses at $10 trillion, has jolted even Trump's staunchest backers. Elon Musk, the Tesla titan once seen as a Trump confidant, has flipped the script, slamming the tariffs as a wrecking ball to free markets and calling for trade zones without barriers. An about-face that stunned MAGA faithful who saw him as an unshakable ally. Billionaire investor Bill Ammon, another vocal Trump booster, warned of an economic winter, arguing the policies are torching investor confidence and dooming businesses to stagnation, a far cry from the growth he once championed. This isn't just elite grumbling, it's a betrayal felt deep in Trump's base. MAGA voters, conservative investors, and small-town supporters who cheered his "America First" rhetoric are reeling as savings vanish and jobs evaporate. "We didn't vote for this," echoes through diners and town halls, a sentiment born from retirement funds gutted by market crashes and livelihoods crushed by corporate layoffs. The tariffs, meant to punish China and resurrect U.S. manufacturing, have instead delivered a 1-2 punch to their wallets, prices for cars, clothes, and gadgets doubling while wages stagnate or disappear. What was sold as a patriotic masterstroke now looks like a misfire, and the disillusionment is palpable. These aren't fringe critics. They're the heart of Trump's movement, questioning whether his gamble has traded their dreams for chaos. The fracture runs deeper than policy debates, it's personal. Musk's pivot to free market advocacy and Ammon's dire forecasts signal a brain trust jumping ship, leaving Trump scrambling to justify a strategy that's hemorrhaging support. Even CEOs who bankrolled his campaign are hedging bets, pulling cash from U.S. stocks as Wall Street reels. This internal mutiny isn't just a PR headache, it's a political time bomb. Without these titans and their grassroots echo chamber, Trump's economic narrative, once a rallying cry of strength, crumbles into a tale of broken promises. The Republican Party, already uneasy with his tariff fixation, faces pressure to rein him in, while voters who once saw him as their champion now see a leader out of touch. As protests swell and former allies like Musk call for course correction, the tariff war's domestic toll reveals a stark truth. Trump's biggest fight might not be with China, but with the unraveling loyalty of those who believed in him most. The MAGA dream, battered by its own architect, teeters on the edge of collapse. A nation in revolt, Trump's tariff disaster fuels protests and a political powder keg. Donald Trump's tariff showdown with China, marked by a 125% U.S. levy and a retaliatory 84% from Beijing, has plunged the American economy into chaos, but the real explosion is happening on the streets. What began as a trade war has morphed into a social uprising, with hundreds of thousands of Americans from coast to coast pouring out in protest, their voices a thunderous rejection of policies that have gutted their lives. The $6.4 trillion stock market collapse, some say $10 trillion, hasn't just spooked investors, it's shattered families, wiping out retirement funds and thrusting millions into debt as jobs vanish and costs soar. A car jumping $6,000, an iPhone doubling to $800, gas prices climbing. These aren't abstract figures but daily burdens crushing the working class, turning Trump. Make America great again, pledge into a bitter punchline. The unrest isn't confined to economics. Protesters aren't just marching against tariffs. They're raging against a government they see as deaf to their pain, piling on grievances like immigration crackdowns and eroding rights. From urban centers to rural backroads, the chants grow louder, uniting the unemployed, families drowning in rising home prices, and even once loyal Trump voters who feel betrayed. "This isn't what we signed up for," they shout, a refrain born from savings erased and futures dimmed. Deadly storms claiming lives, U.S. soldiers dying abroad. Trump's golf outings amid these crises only fan the flames, painting him as indifferent while society frays. The contrast is stark. A leader touting greatness as his people grapple with despair, their faith in his vision replaced by fury. This swelling tide of dissent signals more than frustration. It's a political earthquake in the making. The protests, growing daily, aren't mere outbursts. They're a clarion call for change, a warning that Trump's administration hangs by a thread. If he doesn't pivot, the pressure could topple him, not just from public outrage but from a shifting power dynamic within his own party and beyond. The working class, hit hardest by factory closures and a cost-of-living crisis, leads this charge. Reports show bankruptcies rising and debt-choking households as big firms cut corners to survive. Across America, these aren't just demonstrations. They're a referendum on a presidency that promised prosperity but delivered peril. As the nation teeters, markets in freefall, Bitcoin crashing from $69,000 to $25,000, and Goldman Sachs pegging recession odds at 45%. The unrest hints at a deeper unraveling. Trump's tariff legacy, once a badge of defiance, now risks becoming his undoing, a spark that's lit a fire he may not contain, pushing the White House toward a reckoning with a people no longer willing to wait in silence.